It's probably not though. Stranger Things Season 1, part of this complete breakfast. So Stranger Things Season 1 is a Netflix original series. When it came out, it just exploded. It went wild. So by the time I was going to see it, like I said, the hype was real. Ever have something be so overhyped that you just have to wait until the hype train dies down before you watch it? Yeah, it's like that. So I had to wait until the hype train died down before I watched Stranger Things Season 1. Since then, I've watched it about 3 times. And I'm really glad I waited on this because Stranger Things is excellent. It would have been a shame to have it overhyped by the time I watched it. Apparently, time fades even legend and overhyped. So Stranger Things is pretty much, it starts out as a missing kid story. There's a group of kids, they play D&D together, then one of them gets snatched by this thing. You get a glimpse of it, it's like a monster. It's a monster the kids would later call the Demogorgon. So after that, the story follows a few different people. There's the kid's mom, played by Winona Ryder. There's this sheriff, played by David Harbour. There's a group of the kids' friends that it mostly revolves around. These friends find this little girl named Eleven. Her name's Eleven, they call her Elle. She can apparently do some amazing things, if not stranger things. There's the missing kid's brother and a love triangle with this cute girl and a bully. It sounds a little more high school than it actually is. Point is, it's quite amazing. By amazing, it is a Stephen King story. It's not a Stephen King story, but when watching this, I was like, I cannot not see Stephen King. It's so clearly a Stephen King story from Stephen King in his prime, which is funny because Finn Wolfhard in Stranger Things was also in It by Stephen King. Guess he just likes those stories. Then someone in the show makes a Stephen King reference and it all just made sense. Now, if you didn't know, Stranger Things is ultimately an 80s throwback, an 80s nostalgia trip, an 80s story taking place in the 80s, which is a big thing right now. Looks like 80s nostalgia vomit is its own genre. Sometimes it works, sometimes it just beats you over the head. You're like, yeah, I get what you're doing, and I kind of don't like it. It's too forced. But how Stranger Things does it is the way that works for me, and that is it's an 80s story that takes place in the 80s that looks like it was made by someone who loves stories from the 80s, which if you look at the movies of the 80s, there's a lot to love. But more than that, it looks like a story that fits in the 80s, but just couldn't be made in the 80s. I know the story was thought up well past the 80s, but it feels like a story that could have been made in the 80s, that took place in the 80s, but it was limited by the 80s. Point is, the story of Stranger Things does lend itself to all that 80s nostalgia and taking place in the 80s, but having the freedom to do what they wanted to do, making the show how they wanted to make it, that the 80s just wouldn't have allowed. Granted, like I said, I know Stranger Things was thought up and written well after the 80s. I'm just telling you what it feels like, not what it is. Now, first of all, David Harbour plays the sheriff. He's this small town sheriff that's looking for this kid. David Harbour is great. He has his own past, his own backstory, his own damage that the show slowly reveals. And really, everyone was great. I heard Winona Ryder, there were a few people who were like, I didn't like her, she annoyed me in the show. She never annoyed me. I thought she was actually quite good, surprisingly good. Her character is a bit batshit, but that's not on Winona Ryder, that's on the character. But through that lens, I like what they did with her character because you listen to her character talking, you're like, you're clearly crazy. She believes her son's alive, talking to her through the lights. It's a show called Stranger Things. She's probably not nuts, but you understand that everyone thinks she's nuts. And in her grasp to believe that her son is alive, you do buy the fact that she would buy that fact. You're just bummed out that when David Harbour, the sheriff, is there, the lights don't just light up and start answering yes or no questions there. Probably save a lot of time. Also glad Matthew Modine kinda got a mulligan. We saw him in Dark Knight Rises and we were like, well, okay. But he was good as the government dick. But the youth, all the kids in this show, they are what make it. It's very E.T. in its execution. The kids that know more the truth than the adults know. Because they have the imagination to actually grasp that straw. However, like E.T., unlike a lot of shows and movies that are like, hey, we're harkening back to the 80s, the kids curse and they talk shit. The kids act like kids with no adults around. There's clearly a divide. The kids on this side, adults on this side. It's just childhood. It's the way it is. The show nails that. I also love the fact that the spectrum that they're viewing this through is all Dungeons and Dragons. Really, the entire show is applicable to Dungeons and Dragons, a Dungeons and Dragons metaphor. It's a D&D adventure that they're on. And for me to say the kids have bright futures ahead of them a year after the show came out, it's kind of a no shit statement. Yeah, no kidding, they have futures ahead of them. They also have bright futures behind them at this point because I'm late on my review. Granted, I chose to be so. What Stranger Things also does really well is have a good balance of intrigue and revelation. You want to intrigue people, you want to keep them hooked, you don't want to keep everything from them. So you get a glimpse of something and you have another question. You get a glimpse of something else, you have an answer, but you also have a question. And yes, Stranger Things does deal with an alternate dimension. That's fascinating to me. But the different pockets, the different groups of people all chasing the same thing, whether they know it or not. A bit of their information, a bit of their social circle kind of bleed together, but not totally. It's just enough to be linked. In fact, if they all got into a room and they were like, okay, let's just talk about what we've found, they would have solved this thing like day 2 or 3. However, they just don't know to do that. And one of the things that pleasantly surprised me the most is the bully arc. Yes, there are high school students, social circles, and a romance. So yes, there's gonna be a bully. Funny thing is, you think it's going to go this obvious ass, unbelievable direction, and really doesn't. The bully in the show is not a villain bully. He's not a bully for the sake of bully. There are bullies like that in here, but he's not it. He actually has a fleshed out arc. He grows. He grows as a character. He grows on you. I was really surprised. I don't like bullies, so it's a thing by the end of it to be like, I kind of see where you're coming from. A couple times he does dick out, but I gotta remember he's a high school student. There is a part in this show where the sheriff and Winona Ryder go and talk to somebody that I call exposition lady because that's what she is there for. She's straight up like, okay, here's some information and then here's all of the information. I feel like the show was just more intriguing when you were piecing it together yourself. I would have liked it more if you just didn't get these hard answers from her. Maybe you could have saved the information she gave for season 2, but I'm sure they didn't know they were gonna get a season 2. I'm just saying, if the show didn't give you that information, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. You still would have pieced enough together to be intrigued and pretty fulfilled, but it doesn't actually compromise the whole of Stranger Things. Guys, in the end, Stranger Things is exactly what it intended to be, probably more. It's a very legit, validated story that takes place in the 80s, has 80s nostalgia, 80s style and quality filmmaking, not 80s nostalgia vomit. It has great characters, it has great intrigue. The climax of this, when it hits like the last 20-minute mark of the last episode, is some of the most fulfilling, tear-inducing moments you'll feel. It's just very emotional. Everything's coming together. I loved it. I can't wait to see where the characters go. I can't wait to find out more about the Upside Down. If you haven't seen Stranger Things season 1 yet, treat yourself. I feel like I've learned the trick. It's just now that I know the hype train's going to hit and be real, just hit the hype train at midnight on Friday when season 2 hits. I have a busy weekend because, you know, I have life shit. You won't have to wait a year for my review of season 2. That's what I'm saying. All right, guys, so Stranger Things season 1. Have you seen it? What did you think about it? Whatever you thought, comment below. Let me know. And as always, if you like what you've seen here and you want to see more, click right here to see more.